Hello, welcome to Once Upon a Screen Time. Today is movie day, and keeping it spooky this October, I have chosen to review Drag Me to Hell, a film from 2009. So, let's go. Once upon a time, in a magical land known as California, lived a young woman named Christine Brown. Christine was just your average fairy tale heroine, except instead of being a princess in a tower, she was a lone officer at a bank, desperately trying to impress her boss to land that sweet, sweet promotion. As with most fairy tale characters, Christine's story begins with her making a terrible life decision, denying a loan to an old woman named Mrs. Ganush. Now, this wasn't just any old woman. Mrs. Ganush was more of your classic creepy fairy tale witch type, complete with unsettling dentures and the power to curse the living daylights of anyone who crossed her. So buckle up, because we are about to embark on a journey full of supernatural chaos, gross out horror, and some truly questionable decision making. Welcome to Drag Me to Hell, where being nice to your local elderly population is extremely important, because one wrong move could result in a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Let's dive into the scream-filled fairy tale where buttons are cursed, goats are possessed, and life lessons are learned the hard way. Our story begins with Christine Brown, a bright-eyed, ambitious young woman working at a bank, which in this fairy tale is pretty much the equivalent of working at the evil queen's castle. Christine's life goal is to get promoted to assistant manager because obviously that's the pinnacle of success in the magical land of finance. Standing in her way is her boss, Mr. Jax, who, like all good fairy tale villains, values ruthlessness over kindness. To make matters worse, Christine has to compete with her newbie co-worker Stu, who we can all agree is about as likable as a frog in a business suit. One fateful day, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ganush walks into the bank, looking for Christine's help with an extension on her mortgage. She's behind on her payments and begging for a third extension so she won't lose her home. Now, any reasonable fairy tale heroine would see the desperation in this old woman's eyes and offer her a helping hand. But Christine, eager to prove to her boss that she can make tough decisions, decides to deny the extension. After all, what's one tiny act of cruelty in the grand scheme of corporate ambition? Apparently, it's a big deal. Mrs. Ganush, who looks like she just stepped out of a haunted painting, pleads with Christine, even getting on her knees in a scene that's as sad as it is cringy. But Christine, determined to channel her inner ice queen, sticks to her decision and calls security to remove Mrs. Ganush from the bank. And with that, our heroine has sealed her fate. Because, in case you haven't noticed, messing with creepy old ladies in a horror movie never ends well. Fair warning, never deny a loan to somebody who could be a witch. Later that day, after Christine's ill-advised power move, Mrs. Ganush decides it's time for some good old-fashioned revenge. And because this is a supernatural fairy tale, her revenge is far more creative than just leaving a nasty review for the bank. Mrs. Ganush has something far more sinister in mind. In a scene that feels like it was plucked straight out of a nightmare, Mrs. Ganush ambushes Christine in the bank's parking garage. What follows is an epic showdown between Christine and this not-so-defenseless elderly woman, featuring an absurd amount of physical violence, including Mrs. Ganush gumming Christine's entire face with her dentures. I guess horror movies were never known for their subtlety. But the masterpiece comes when Mrs. Ganush rips a button off Christine's coat, mutters some ancient curse words, and hands the button back to her. You see, in this particular fairy tale, cursed buttons are all the rage. Christine, being a modern woman who has no clue what's going on, shrugs off the incident as just another weird encounter in the life of a loan officer. Big mistake. Because that button, it's cursed. And what kind of curse, you ask? The kind where a terrifying demon called the Lamia comes to torment you for 3 days before literally dragging you to hell. Literally. Another warning, if a creepy lady curses your button, it's time to panic. After her run-in with Mrs. Ganush, Christine's life takes a rapid turn for the worse. At first, it's just little things, like creepy shadows, strange noises, and disturbing dreams. But then things get weird, really weird. As in, what kind of messed up fairy tale is this? Kind of weird. One night, Christine is sitting at home with her boyfriend, Clay, who is way too calm about the fact that his girlfriend is being haunted. But then again, in every good fairy tale, the boyfriend is either oblivious or completely useless, and Clay is no exception. The next few days are a blur of supernatural torment for Christine. She's haunted by nightmarish visions of Mrs. Ganush, shadow figures, and of course, the ever-present Lamia. There's one delightful scene where Christine vomits up a ridiculously large amount of maggots and worms, which is just the kind of magical moment you want in a fairy tale. At this point, Christine is in full panic mode. She's haunted, cursed, and on the fast track to being dragged into the fiery pits of hell. But hey, at least she still has her job. For now. Look, if you start hallucinating violent demons, it might be time to call a professional. Every fairy tale has that one wise old character who explains what the heck is going on. And in Drag Me to Hell, that role is filled by Ramjas, a psychic who runs a fortune-telling shop. Desperate for answers, Christine visits Ramjas and asks him to figure out what is happening to her. With all the seriousness of a medieval wizard, Ramjas drops the bombshell. Christine has been cursed by Mrs. Ganush, and the demon Lamia will torment her for 3 days before literally dragging her to hell. No big deal. Ramjas, being the bearer of bad news, offers Christine a few options to stop the curse. The first option is to make a sacrifice, but Christine quickly dismisses the idea of killing an animal. Second option, Christine can pass the cursed object, the button, onto someone else, thus transferring the curse and avoiding the fiery fate. But there's a catch. If Christine passes the curse to another person, they'll be the one getting dragged to hell. Because, fairy tales, they love moral dilemmas. Christine, understandably, isn't thrilled about either option. But as her torment grows more intense, she realizes she might not have a choice. Take note, if a psychic tells you you're doomed, you probably are. Since sacrificing her cat did not work, Ramjas suggests a more traditional method, a seance. Because when you're being haunted by a malevolent demon, gathering a bunch of strangers around a table to summon spirits is clearly the best idea. Let's welcome Sean Sandina, a powerful medium who specializes in banishing evil spirits. Sean Sandina has a personal score to settle with the Lamia, having encountered the demon once before in a tragic backstory involving a young boy being dragged to hell. Because why not add trauma to this entire thing? Sean Sandina, along with Christine and a group of other psychic-type characters, prepare for the seance, hoping to banish the Lamia once and for all. What follows is a scene straight out of a supernatural circus. The Lamia makes its presence known in a spectacularly over-the-top fashion, complete with possessed furniture, demonic voices, and a goat that gets temporarily possessed and starts hurling insults at everyone in the room. Yes, there's a possessed goat, and it's exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Naturally, the seance doesn't go as planned. The Lamia is too strong to be banished, and Sean Sandina, in an effort to save Christine, ends up being the sacrifice. But even her noble act isn't enough to stop the curse. The Lamia is still gunning for Christine, and the clock is ticking. Moral of the story so far? When someone suggests a seance, just say no. With the seance failing and the demon's presence becoming more and more terrifying, Christine is left with only one option: pass the cursed button to someone else. It's the ultimate moral dilemma. Should she sacrifice someone else to save herself, or face the horrifying reality of being dragged to hell? After a few failed attempts to pawn the cursed button off to someone, including her annoying co-worker Stu, who deserved it, Christine decides that she's not that heartless. Instead, she hatches a brilliant plan. She'll give the button back to Mrs. Ganush, the woman who cursed her in the first place. There's just one small problem. Mrs. Ganush is dead. But in this twisted fairy tale, death is just a minor inconvenience. Christine digs up Mrs. Ganush's grave in a scene that is equally disgusting and absurd, shoving the cursed button into the corpse's mouth and declaring herself free from the curse. Victory, right? Wrong. If you're going to re-gift a cursed object, maybe check the fine print. After her graveyard shenanigans, Christine breathes a sigh of relief. She's convinced she's free from the curse. The Lamia is gone and she can finally go back to her normal, non-haunted life. In fact, things seem to be looking up. She even reconciles with her boyfriend Clay, who's been suspiciously supportive throughout this entire ordeal. But as Christine heads to the train station to meet Clay for a weekend away, she realizes something's wrong. Clay pulls out a familiar envelope, the one that contained the cursed button. Except it turns out Christine never actually gave Mrs. Ganush the button. She got the envelopes mixed up, and the cursed button is still very much in her possession. Just as Christine realizes her fatal mistake, the ground opens up beneath her, and in true fairy tale fashion, the Lamia drags her screaming into the fiery pits of hell. There's no last-minute rescue, no redemption, just a final brutal twist that reminds us all that fairy tales don't always have happy endings. Moral of the story? Always double check your envelopes, especially if they contain cursed objects. And so, our twisted fairy tale comes to an end. Drag Me to Hell is not your typical bedtime story. It's a story where our heroine doesn't get her happy ending, where moral dilemmas have very real consequences, and where seances are always a terrible idea. In the end, Christine learned the hard way that there are no shortcuts to escaping a curse. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation where a mysterious old woman curses you with a button, remember this fairy tale and tread carefully. And whatever you do, avoid seances and possessed ghosts at all.